Today's video is all about arguably my most challenging and therefore I think proudest DIY achievements to date. Tiling this kitchen floor with these massive 1.2 metre wide porcelain tiles. Why so? Well, I was told I'd be mad to take it on because it was too difficult, particularly when my only previous experience of tiling was to do the shower area in the family bathroom. But I'm stubborn like that, so in today's video I'm going to explain every single step I took to make a success of something everyone said I shouldn't attempt. As I reckon by arming you all with that information, there's no reason why you couldn't do this as well. And if you're new to my channel, it'd be amazing to have you subscribe. There's a link on screen now. A year ago, we ripped out our kitchen and removed tons and tons of soil, rubble and just about everything else so we could install an underfloor heating system in our kitchen and TV room. There's a link to that video coming up on screen now, but suffice to say this involved laying a concrete sub-base, 100mm of insulation, followed by a wet or hydronic heating system, followed by 50mm of screed. And that's where we got to when it came to tiling the floor. Now, we wanted porcelain tiles because they're ultra durable, easy to maintain and would transfer the heat from the underfloor heating system very efficiently. Sitting here right now in the doorway between the kitchen, which has been tiled, and our TV room, which hasn't. And this is a really useful transition to show you here to emphasize the next point, which is about the decoupling layer. All floors expand and contract due to thermal changes and moisture content. And this point is emphasized here where we've got this massive crack in the doorway. Now, screed tends to crack in the threshold areas between two rooms just because of this being the most acute place where movement's going to happen. Which is why we put this crack inducer in the doorway. And at this particular point, we don't actually have any underfloor heating pipes. But this crack, for anyone who's skeptical about this, shows why it's so important to have a decoupling layer. Because you've got to allow the substrate and the tiles to move independently. Now, I always assumed that a decoupling mat's job was to completely separate the substrate from the tiled surface above. So in other words, there wasn't any adhesive underneath the decoupling mat. But that's not generally the case. There are mats like this that 100% decouple the tiles from the surface below, and these are particularly useful for frequently changed floors and sensitive heritage substrates. But the decoupling mat I went for, like this market-leading Detra mat from Schluter, is glued both to the substrate and to the tiled surface above. And as we recently discussed on my Discord forum, the uncoupling happens within the structure of the mat itself to prevent any cracking passing up through the substrate into the tiled surface. Movement joints are also recommended to break the floor up into separate sections. But I looked into this and decided that certainly for a domestic setting like this, they were a bit ugly. Although to be fair, this one doesn't look too bad. And so I took the risk and touched wood. So far, I haven't had any cracking in the tiled surface that would suggest that I should have installed one. Schluter kindly sent me a few samples of their industry-leading Detra mat decoupling membrane, but I couldn't get any of their reps to confirm that it was definitely okay for my whopping 1.2 metre tiles, although their marketing stuff would suggest it is. And so, being aware of the quality of Ardex's adhesives and keen to keep everything under one system roof to ensure compatibility with all the different elements, I decided to go with Ardex's Indoor Tech Flexbone VA uncoupling mat. It's a high load bearing uncoupling mat ideal for large format tiles in high traffic areas. Oh, and I should point out I haven't been paid anything by them for using it. At this point, I was bombarded with instructions from my Discord members, mostly from Sam, who was also amused I was stupidly taking this job on, and also from Ardex, who sent me a brilliant set of recommendations. The importance of the screed being dry. The subfloor should have a surface regularity such that any gap under a 2 metre straight edge doesn't exceed 3mm. I'm glad to say the boys from Riflo did a great job of this with my Semfloor screed. There's a good reason for this I'll come on to in a bit, and the screed surface should be abraded to remove any weak and friable surface material. Now, as the screed dried out, a series of bubbles on the surface left a mottled texture, and whilst I was initially wondering how to sand this, I bought some 60 grit aluminium oxide discs from Amazon. Not the best quality, but with this many at this price you can't go wrong, and with my random orbit sander attached to my DIY Cyclone vacuum, I was able to remove all imperfections and abrade the entire floor nicely, ready for the primer. Next up, the substrate needed priming, and I was recommended Ardex P51 acrylic primer, diluted 1 to 3 with clean water. I applied this with a soft bristled sweeping brush. I've got to say I really like this stuff, and I've even primed our dusty TV room floor, as it's going to be a while until we can get this carpeted. It was time to get the flex bone ready, and before gluing it down I did a dry fit to check I had enough and to get each piece trimmed to size. The adhesive I'd be using, Ardex X7 RS1, is rapid set with a 20-minute open time. That's the amount of time you've got to work with it. So I didn't want to be messing around cutting sheets of uncoupling mat whilst the adhesive was sat going off in the tub. The uncoupling mat comes in rolls and also flat sheets, with a very slight difference in size of the pattern depending on which you go for, and I was sent a combination of the two so I could see which I preferred. I think the rolls are favoured by the pro installers as it can be rolled out quickly and I guess takes up less room in the van. What you buy depends on how much you need, and you can of course subdivide each run by cutting it so you're not having to tool long areas like this with adhesive. And what about the adhesive? Well, this is where I was most grateful for Ardex's advice. I put a shopping list together which included this ready mixed decoupling adhesive, but I was told the X7R cement based version, which since my video has now been replaced with the improved X7R S1, would be better at wetting out the fleece lining on the back of the mats, giving better adhesion. And now for arguably one of the most important elements to guarantee a successful project like this. I had a very expensive trip to Lidl when I was charging the EV a few years ago. I went there and came back with a Breville toasty machine and this double paddle cement mixer. Now this sat on the shelf, not knowing what to do with it for a couple of years. I just thought it would come in handy, and oh my god, has this delivered on this project. With these two colour-coded quick release paddles, variable speed, and also this electronic speed control button, it's mixed with ease everything I've thrown at it on this project, and there has been a lot, and I think it cost me about 60 quid. So the mixing paddle is essential, but so too is a measuring bucket and some scales, because this allows you to mix up less adhesive, at least until you've found your feet and are confident about what you're doing. Right, I've got processed just under 2.5 litres of water, not mixing a full 20 kilogram bag, I'm cutting it in two. So put this on the scales, set it to 0. Now I'm putting 10 kilograms of the X7R into the water. Completely messed up because I don't use this bucket to mix. This is what I should have done, but you get the idea. And then it was in with the paddle mixer, and because I'd measured out the quantities precisely, I wasn't worried about whether I'd got the mix right. I'll talk about my setup in a minute, but it's a good idea to have a second bucket full of water to keep that paddle clean. I bought this 4x4mm notch trowel, again on Ardex's recommendation, to give the uncoupling mat a consistent even bed of adhesive. Laid the matting in place and then smoothed it down with a plasterer's trowel. And then, like with so many DIY jobs we all do, the more confident I got, the longer runs I was able to work, and I'm pretty sure by the end of it I was mixing up a bag at a time. And with the final run done, I could turn my mind to the tiling. We went with these uber large format tiles because we wanted something a bit industrial, similar to polished concrete. It's not a massive room, but an interior designer once said, when you break the rules, magic happens. So bring on the big tiles, and to be honest, we've never looked back. I decided not to stagger the tiles, but to line them up in a grid. This raises a few problems. I was going for a 3mm grout gap. Any mistakes on alignment and this would be amplified across the floor. Also, as Sam pointed out on Discord, with such small grout gaps and so little margin for error, it was crucial I went for rectified tiles. These are cut to a precise tolerance. As you can imagine, if one tile was slightly larger than the next, those 3mm gaps would be giving me a nightmare. So my porcelain tiles are rectified. They're 1200mm, but the finished dimensions are 1195. At this point we made a massive mistake. We had 3 samples from Basic Stone and decided to go with a slightly darker Ike beige. The tiles arrived and I had transported about 20 into the house when I realised they were too dark. Basic happily agreed to take them back and did everything they could to minimise the cost, but the mistake still cost us £300 for a new delivery of the lighter Ike white tile, but we're pleased we made the switch. It took me a while to get this right. Starting in the middle of the room is generally a pretty good rule of thumb, but with my tiles being so large, I wanted to minimise cutting, maximise the width in this dining area where they'd be on show, and hide as many joints as possible under the kitchen units. So I decided a different approach was required, and I imported a scaled floor plan into my cheapo basic version of Photoshop Elements 2020 and set up a grid system to the sides of the tiles. I could then move the grid around the room until I found the optimum placing of my tiles, taking into account all the walls, units, etc. So I've used this as my rough guide, and I decided that I needed to start a line of tiles going across pretty much the centre of the room. So I put these two dark tiles down, and then I've got my laser level pinging a laser line across the room, and then I've taken my laser measure, you can use the tape measure, and I've pinged at 2 points across that laser line, because what I wanted to do is get the bifold door as near to parallel with these grout lines as possible, because I don't want to have a weird wedge shape where the bifolds are. And I am 3 mil out, and I'm happy with that, so I'm going to crack on. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, the first 2 tiles, take a marker pen around the edge so I know exactly where they need to be positioned when I've got the adhesive in place. And having marker penned around those first 2 tiles, I then laid another 5 just to double check my measurements. So we've talked about the mixing paddle, which will seriously come into its own mixing that tile adhesive shortly. But let's have a quick look at most of the other stuff you're going to need. When the Ardex rep came to visit me, the first thing he asked was, "Where's your tile cutter?" By which I'm guessing he was talking about one of these. I told him I didn't need one as I was going to use my grinder, which he looked pretty confused about. But that is exactly what I did, and I bought this tile cutting disc and a tutor cut. More on these in a minute. I bought this diamond block to keep the cutting disc sharp, and this diamond hole cutter, which seemed like a good idea, but I didn't actually need it. You'll need a flat base to cut on, very important that it's flat. I use this old palette and have a £150 mistake to talk about later on to explain why it's so important you're cutting on a flat surface. Especially important for these large format tiles, I also needed a thumping tile beater, replacing this one I bought from eBay that never worked out of the box. Next up, Ardex's X11W tile adhesive. Brilliant stuff this, it's got 45-minute open time and it's fixotropic. What does that mean, you ask? Well, it means it liquefies when agitated. We'll be using that 4mm notch trowel to back butter the tiles. What? Don't worry, I'll explain. And we need a 10mm notch trowel to spread the adhesive. I bought 2 but didn't really need this massive one if I'm honest. Knee pads also essential, and some people would say get knee pads on wheels, but I didn't bother because they're quite expensive for a one-off project like this. We've obviously got that massive spirit level, which was a big investment, but I've used it on a few jobs now, so it's already paid for itself. Bucket trowel for dolloping the adhesive onto the floor, and these Ruby Delta leveling system strips and wedges. And fast fix pliers. Also very important, ear defenders, because this mixer is noisy. And get yourself some sort of protective gloves as well. There's a few other bits and bobs, but we'll come on to those as we need them. So I just want to talk you through my setup here because it's so important to stay tidy on jobs like this when the tiling adhesive is such a messy product to work with. So there's my mixing bucket. I then have another bucket full of water which the paddle mixer goes into as soon as I finish mixing. Don't bother cleaning that off, I just leave it in there, and then at the end of the day I can clean it off, and because it's gone straight into the bucket, it's always really easy to clean. We have another bucket here full of water. After every single troweling, these trowels come back here now systematically after every single use, and I clean them off and then put them back into this bucket ready for the next time I need them. And finally I've got another mixing bucket there to get all the quantities right when I'm mixing the tiling adhesive. So I'm now onto the tile laying part of this video, and there's quite a lot to get through here, so I thought the best way to do that would be to explain to you every single problem that you potentially face when laying large tiles like this and how I approached those issues. Okay, first up we've got tile cutting, and there are a few points to make here. As I said to you, the Ardex wrap was slightly incredulous that I was trying to use my little 125mm grinder to cut tiles, and there are a few reasons why that was successful. Point 1, I had a good base to cut on. And what do I mean by that? Well, I used one of the many pallets that was left over from the kitchen building works, and I got it completely flat, and that's very important. By flat, I'm talking about the actual surface that you're laying the tile onto. Particularly for large tiles like this, it's very important that that surface is completely flat with no gaps underneath it. I found a pallet that was particularly good, and the other thing about pallets is they have natural gaps between each plank, which is a great place for your grinder to run between. And point two, the underside of the pallet where it touches the floor needs to be completely flat as well. And for that, I use some of my glazing packers. It's really good to have a tub of these lying about because they are good for a multitude of jobs. Why is it so important to have it flat? Well, I cut the tiles in two phases. Firstly in the kitchen, then I came back a few weeks later to do the sort of utility area. The kitchen tile cutting worked flawlessly. I didn't have a single mishap across the entire room. A few weeks later though, when I came back to it, it was a completely different story. The first two tiles I cut on the same pallet split, cracked. And the reason for that was because by that point there'd been a lot of rain, the pallet had moved slightly, and there was a little bit of vibration as I was cutting each tile. A minute adjustment of the glazing packer solved the problem, but it cost me 140 quid. If the base is completely flat and there's no vibration when you start cutting, generally speaking, you're going to be all right. And we'll come on to the technique of cutting in a minute. Next up, there was choosing the right blade, and I'm grateful to Pro Tiler Tools here, who I bought most of the kit from for this job. As you can see, there are a perplexing number of tile cutting blades on the market, and they suggested this one, and it didn't disappoint, as I've cut all the kitchen tiles with it, occasionally giving it a sharpen with this diamond sharpening stone, which I also bought from them. I also bought from them a tutor cut. I've never used one before, but it was suggested on the website, and I figured anything that might make my life easier was worth having. Again, I'm glad I did, as it helps maintain a straight line and a 90-degree cut, and also minimises chipping by virtue of the way the guide rests on the tile as you cut. In actual fact, across the entire room, there are only a few cuts on show. The bifolds were the biggest test, but I planned it so that I'd done quite a lot of cutting by the time I got to them, and I'm pretty pleased with the result. As for technique, I tended to cut from both ends and meet somewhere in the middle, as I found if I just cut from one end, as I neared the edge, there was a chance the tile would crack along the least line of resistance to get to the edge. Yes, you ended up with a very small difference where the two cuts meet, but this can easily be trimmed flat. As I said, I bought a diamond drilling bit to help with the 90-degree cuts, but actually found it was just as easy to go right into the corner with the cutting blade. It's always easier to see one side of the cut, depending on whether you're left or right-handed, so I got round this by scribing two cut lines on each tile and simply cutting down the middle. That way your eye can reference the easiest line for it to see and guide the blade along that line accordingly. And awkward cuts, well, I just improvised like this. We've talked about the X11W tile adhesive. I mixed it in a similar way to the X7RD Decoupling Mat adhesive. Initially, mixing up just half a bag in the same way, worried I might not be able to use it all before it went off. Mixer set to the slower first gear. But half a bag only did just over one tile, and with an extended 45-minute open time, I needn't have worried, particularly as I got more used to it, and by getting a few tiles ready before mixing the adhesive, I didn't have a problem with the adhesive going off before I had a chance to use it. Mixing the adhesive could be a potential problem, but with the double paddle mixer it was effortless walking around the bucket so as to exert myself as little as possible. Now we're on to adhesion, specifically making sure the entire tile comes into contact with the adhesive underneath. This is one of the biggest issues with botched tile jobs, particularly when cowboys just dab the adhesive onto the back of the tiles. With tiles as big as mine that can have a bit of a bow in the middle, it's particularly important you have total adhesion to prevent cracking down the line when loads are placed on an area with a void beneath, what is, let's remember, quite a thin tile. And that's why you apply adhesive to the back of the tile as well as the floor, and this process is known as back buttering. Using the 4mm notch trowel I use for the decoupling mat, I'm applying a consistent ribbed layer to the back of the tile and then folding it over to ensure complete coverage or wetting of the back of the tile. And to any pro tilers watching this, don't be too critical, as this was literally the first tile I'd done. The only I'm doing, so I know how much adhesive to put on the floor, I'm just marking each tile with a marker pen. I know pro tilers probably use a chalk line, but quite hard single-handedly doing this, bringing a chalk line down. So I'm just doing it individually, bit by bit like this. Then using the 10mm notch trowel, I apply a consistent ribbed layer to the floor and then lowered the tile onto the adhesive. Now I snapped a few tiles taking them back up because the suction becomes so powerful. More on that in a minute. But for you guys, I risked pulling up this tile, and you can see, even without properly pressing it down or using the Batipav thumping tile beater, how the adhesive has consistently fixed itself to the entire underside of the tile. And with the tile lowered again, I used the tile beater to properly and evenly distribute that adhesive across the underside of the tile. And with the first tile in position, it was time to repeat the process with the second, checking each time the levels of my spirit level, and then in with the ruby delta strips and wedges to ensure consistency of gap between each, and also uniformity of height from one tile to the next. More on those in a minute. I was concerned doing this job single-handed how to lower each tile safely. Remember, these tiles were heavy at 31 kilograms each. And so I had an idea. I took one of my tie-down straps I used to clamp the engineering oak floor I've laid over the years, and got the metal shop down the road to put an extra bend on the floor plate. Then I took a pine offcut and routed a groove in the long edge. I could then place the tile on the plank and lower it to the floor with the tie down strap, and the routed edge on the plank would keep it roughly the right height off the floor when lowered, thereby not displacing too much adhesive from underneath the tile as I lowered my tile drawbridge. And generally speaking, this was a revelation and saved me a lot of potential back problems. But before you rush out and make one, it wasn't without its drawbacks. Sometimes the sheer weight of the tile would cause the plank to slip backwards, meaning I had to push the tile back into position, and this squeezed adhesive up into the gap between each tile. And as I'll explain, it's important to keep these gaps adhesive free. Now there are two things I should have done here. Maybe put a spike under the plank to keep it still, although this would have compromised the waterproofing of the decoupling mat. A better idea would have been to use the ruby suction cup to lift up the tile into position once lowered, or actually, given the power of the suction cup, maybe dispense with the strap invention altogether and just lower each tile with the cup, although this would have put a lot more strain on my back. And let's have a quick look at this, because this suction, as it's been fantastic, this ruby. It's raining at the moment, so maybe I won't impact on it too much. Basically, you put that down on the tile and press that pump in, and then you're up and running. And the longer this project went on, the more comfortable I got using this suction cup. Shifting entire, it's probably not in the middle of that properly, you release it like that, shifting entire 30 kilogram tiles vertically with it. Not to say you should lull yourself into a complete sense of security with it, because you know there were times where I put the tile down and then it fell, but generally speaking, as you can see, this thing is absolutely fantastic. It's £69, but pretty essential and therefore money well worth spending. Now, it seems an obvious point that you want to start with a completely level floor, but there's a very good reason for this. With a level floor at the outset, if you can roll out an identical process in terms of tooling the adhesive for every tile, you should have very little work to do once the tile is down. And you shouldn't have to do too much pulsing, too much leveling. If I didn't do what I'm doing right now, so I had a beautifully flat back bottom tile, every tile I put down would have a different level, and it would be a nightmare and make the job so much longer. Just before laying the tile, consistent notch. That was probably the best one I've done. But I just want to show you something here. I have been making the mistake of combing it as neat as I can, then doing the final comb. What I'm doing now is I'm leaving it quite messy, because what that does is when you do your final comb, you get the nice big channels. And if you do it too neatly before that, You find the channels. I'll try and show you an example. Like this, you see those there? Those are too weak into my mind. And that can happen a lot if you comb it too neatly before you do your final pass. I'm going to shove a bit more down there. Just something I wanted to point out for the sake of completeness. But in the real world, it's not always that straightforward. And to illustrate the point, the floor drops slightly where the bifolds are, or maybe I just slightly incline the tiles up to that point. And so now suddenly, as I'm building up the adhesive above the level created by the 10mm notch trowel, I'm in the land of complete guesswork trying to get the level right, in the knowledge that once I put the tile down, I probably won't be able to pull it back up again without snapping it. Although on this occasion I was able to lever the tile up, but you can see what mess I was getting myself in. Thank God for the tile beater that got me out of trouble in this corner of the room. But the end result of all that artificial levelling with the tile beater is I've made my only mistake in the entire kitchen, I think, in this area here, where I've ended up with a tile which is probably 1 millimetre, possibly 2 millimetres too high. It's slightly raised from the other 3 tiles in this corner, whereas at the other side of the tile, it's absolutely bang on. A couple other things I use to help with alignment. Slightly crude the tool, but to get I've got 3 mil to play with on the grout joints, so to get the joint absolutely bang on, I've got this bit of wood, which I'm pretty confident isn't going to damage the tile. Just gently tapping it into position. And then every now and again, to check my grout lines are more or less in the right place, I'm using my laser level and the laser line. Got a whole object against it and I can see where we're at. I hope you're still tuned in, because if you're not, you'll miss probably the most important tool I use to achieve a consistent flat surface and consistent grout line gaps. The Ruby Delta level system with its strips and wedges. There are lots of systems out there like the Ruby Cyclone that you don't need a setting tool for, but I went for the Delta strips and wedge system with 3mm wide strips to guarantee my consistent gaps. And I also bought this setting tool, which I'm really pleased about, as it made the process of clicking in the wedges really simple once I'd set the tool to the right depth. And I mentioned I had a 2-week gap before completing the job. At this point I realised I'd forgotten to put wedges in this doorway, but out came the Dremel to cut some new slots in the adhesive and modify the strips so they could be inserted into the hard adhesive. I mentioned earlier the importance of keeping the gap free of adhesive. It didn't occur to me why until I started to remove the clips, which you do by brutally kicking them away with a boot. Clips with adhesive around them snap off at the surface, leaving you a lot of joint cleaning to do before grouting. And as you can see, I had a lot of those, whereas clips free of adhesive snap off cleanly, leaving you a lovely clean joint. And how did I clean those earlier joints that had too much adhesive in? Well, I used the same tile cutter blade on my grinder to remove any delta strips that were too close to the surface in the gap, which with this blade is actually surprisingly easy to do without causing any damage to the tile. And a combination of razor blade and mortar raking tool to remove any other adhesive residues. And given how time consuming this was across the whole kitchen floor, you can see how important it is to make sure you don't get any adhesive in those gaps as you're laying each tile. Pro tilers will probably make fun of me having to do this, but I'm not trying to show perfection. I'm showing you the learning process I went through, because as you saw later on, I made sure the gaps were adhesive free. But I got there and the floor was finally ready for grouting. 2 other things to mention before the grouting. Firstly, I'm carpeting this TV room, so there'll be a transition from tile to probably sisal, and so I decided to put an aluminium profile in to protect the edge of the tile, particularly whilst we wait to finish the other room. So I bought this Schluter profile again from Pro Tiler Tools and glued it in before laying the last tile. And the triangular wedges to protect the profile from scuffing, to hide a temporary coax cable and give our RoboVac a leg up into the kitchen. The other thing to tell you about is our sunken mat. I wondered whether to bother with this, as we'll be installing a porch outside, but we decided the floor would get filthy without it, and it was a handy way of saving money after I broke those last 2 tiles. Again, to protect the edge of the tiles, I've used that same Schluter profile, which I've mitered at the edges for a really clean finish. And the mat is coir that I bought from a local independent DIY store where they sell it on the roll. It's messy stuff coir, the vacuum doesn't like it, but it looks the business. You're probably wondering how long it took. What I haven't told you is that this whole job was being done under fairly intense time pressure as I lost a week to COVID. So with the decoupling mat down the previous week, I started on Monday the 11th of March and had 48 hours to lay the floor, with the kitchen install starting on Wednesday the 13th. By 7:15 PM on that first Monday evening, I had only laid 3 tiles. After a 2 AM finish, by 9 AM the next morning I had 8 tiles down, and after another 2 AM finish, by Wednesday morning I had just enough down for the kitchen install to commence. The final 11 tiles, once I'd made a trip to Basingstoke to pick up 2 more to replace the ones I cracked, went down over a month later. Lugging those tiles around, mixing multiple buckets of adhesive, left me exhausted and aching so much I was reaching for the painkillers each night. So be realistic, take your time, so unlike me, you don't put too much pressure on yourself. Now you'd think the grouting would be the easiest bit for me, wouldn't you? But it wasn't. It was harder actually than laying the floor. Partly because I messed it up in this shower area. You see, whilst it's pretty good here, I was getting all right at it by this point. But where I started, it's definitely too shallow in the joint. And this was either because I got the mix wrong, or more likely I tried to clean off the joints before the grout had properly gone off. So this time round I was hypersensitive to making the same mistake again. What grout did I use? Well, this was also a tricky one. Sticking with my plan of using Ardex products throughout, I had 2 options, the Ardex Flex FS or Ardex Flex FL. The FS is for narrower joints and has a longer open time than the FL. But my 3mm joints were at the upper limit of the FS, but the lower limit of the FL. The Ardex rep recommended the FL, but in the end I went with the FS, and I'm really pleased I did, because I would have seriously struggled with the limited open time of the FL. Colour-wise, you're spoilt for choice with I think over 35 colours. I went with Fresh Snowdrop, which I think was a recommendation of Basingstoke, so thanks must go to them for that, because I'm really pleased with the colour match. What I did do is mix up small batches. I think this batch was too large. I ended up having to throw away some because it had gone off before I could use it. So this was a sort of more manageable quantity. Notice I'm using a smaller mixing paddle for the grout than those double paddles I used earlier. And I thought I'd invest in a decent tile grouter's float, this one from Marshalltown, to replace my old float that I'd used a lot on the outdoor patio. The mixed proportions are on the bag, and I followed these religiously like I did for the adhesive. You end up with what seems to be quite a sloppy mix initially, although it quickly goes off, so in my experience you do need to work quickly, tooling it as thoroughly as you can into the gap and wiping away the excess to leave it flush with the surface. You can already see here how the mixture is firming up, and I recorded this in April, so it wasn't exactly hot yet, which itself can reduce the working time. So what I'm doing, my little plan anyway, is to clean off as much residue right up to the joint as possible at the point which is now that I'm wanting to clean this particular joint, because I've touched it and it's not leaving any residue on my finger, so I think that's ready. But by taking away most of the residue on the tile, what I'm trying to achieve is not to have to over wipe the joint. So I'm being really careful not to touch the joint. I mean, a lot of tilers would probably say this is ridiculously long-winded, Charlie. And now I've done that, I'm just going over it with the sponge. I bought this Vitrex sponge which has curved edges, which is meant to obviously remove less of the grout as you go at the grout joint at a diagonal pattern. But of course, stupidly, the sponge has only got curved edges on one side, so you can already see how I'd forgotten about that and flipped the sponge over and was using it on the straight cut edges, because it was so tempting to do this with the other side of the sponge being clean. But as I said earlier, I just find grouting really difficult, particularly on these large profile tiles. Yes, there's seemingly less grouting to do, but the tiles are so big it's like you're grouting a motorway. And whilst the working time would seem to be ample, I found, as I said, it went off really quickly. I should hasten to add I did not have the underfloor heating on at any point of this project. So it was a constant battle against time to get as much grout into the joints before the grout went off, and then to try and clean the joints again before the grout had set. And this was that tile I was telling you about earlier where I made a bit of a mistake with the height. But you know what? I don't think this looks too bad. I think the grout is about the right height in the joints, and look at my lovely straight lines. Well, that's it. Finally got to the end of that video. I never thought I'd hear myself say that, and I have to say I've been dreading doing it for that reason, because I thought it was going to be a long one. If you've got to the end, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found it useful. I often say on my videos that we can pull off some pretty amazing stuff as DIYers if we do the planning, and this project is a good example of that. And I've got to say I wouldn't have been able to achieve any of this without all the help and input, knowledge and advice that a lot of people put in. We had Dave at Ardex, we had the team at Pro Tiler Tools, and not forgetting Basic Stone. So special thanks must go to them for sort of helping me to make this happen. Details of everything that I've talked about today will, as usual, be in the description below the video, which you can access by clicking on the More button. Now, I haven't given you any prices, have I? I'll try and put those together over the next couple of weeks and post them on Patreon and buy me a coffee. So if you're a member of my channel, keep an eye out for those. I'm off now to try and finish this kitchen. As you will have seen from watching today's video, there's a lot still to do. Skirtings to install, banquette seating, lots of things in the pipeline. So see you soon. And finally, if you're new to my channel, it would mean so much to me to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here. And don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads.